Good morning, everyone, and we'd like to welcome our distinguished witnesses. This month, around the world, we recognize Pride Month, a celebration that started as a protest to advance the rights of the LGBTQI plus identifying people and ensure equal treatment under the law. In anticipation of this month, we organized this hearing focused on the fight to protect these important civil rights in Europe and in Eurasia. Under the leadership of Chairman Meeks, this will be the first hearing held by the House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee focused solely on the advancement of LGBTQI plus rights. But it won't be the last. And it's built on legislative work of many of my colleagues, especially those on the subcommittee. Representative David Cicilline, the chair of the Congressional LGBTQ plus Equality Caucus, has been leading the way with legislation like the Equality Act and the Global Respect Act, and Representative Titus has reintroduced the GLOBE Act just this month. Importantly, later this month, Chairman Meeks will hold a hearing on LGBTQI plus rights globally. All of these efforts are based on the belief in universal rights for all people. I'm proud to stand with the human rights activists and defenders fighting for this cause. Indeed, as a result of the work of human rights groups around the world, great strides have been made in the advancement of equal rights for all people, including LGBTQI plus identifying people. The European Union, along with our own country, are now considered some of the most open and free places for LGBTQI plus identifying people to not only live, but to prosper. Now we, the United States, as an historic leader for human rights globally, must make it clear that LGBTQI plus rights are universal. And I commend the Biden administration for making it a U.S. policy to lead by the power of our example in the cause of advancing this important human right to all people around the world. For this reason, we're here today to highlight and uplift the voices of this community that we continue to tirelessly work with to pave the way towards equality at home and abroad. Fortunately, in some countries in Europe and Eurasia, this work is far from over. And some LGBTQ plus I plus communities experience a range in discriminatory practices and outright violence. For this reason, I've called this hearing and invited activists and experts on the ground in Europe and Eurasia to speak to the challenges faced by LGBTQI plus community members in the region and how the United States and its partners can create and implement tangible change that will protect these important human rights. Inspired by initiatives like a resolution passed by the European Parliament declaring the European Union and LGBTQI freedom zone this morning, with the support of many of its members of the subcommittee, I introduced a resolution that underscores the right of the LGBTQI plus identifying people to equal and unalienable human rights around the world, including Europe and Eurasia. We can and do, and we must do much more to uphold and promote the equal rights protection of these identifying people so that they too can live prosperous, happy, and free lives. That said, I'd like to welcome the witnesses who are joining us today. We're deeply grateful for your willingness to share your knowledge and advice with the subcommittee to better inform us and all in the U.S. And our transatlantic allies important information and experiences for the advancement of rights at home, here and abroad. I'll now turn to the ranking member, Representative Fitzpatrick, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Keating, and to our friend and colleague David Cicilline, and thanks to all the witnesses here today. And this is an incredibly important topic, one very important to me, and it's also timely, as June is Pride Month here in the United States. And today we will discuss the LGBTQI plus rights in Europe and Eurasia. I'm sure our witnesses will discuss the progress that has been made over the last few decades, as well as areas that need immediate and decisive remedies. The Council of Europe Steering Committee for Human Rights noted substantial progress regarding the legal and social recognitions of the LGBTQI plus persons across its 47 member states over the last decade. However, they also recognize that the wide variation in their rights and protections lend itself to a myriad of challenges. In a 2021 annual report by the Council of Europe's Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, officials warned of a growing backlash against the protection of LGBTQI plus persons' human rights. Oppressive political policies that target members of the community, like those in Russia, are a strong indicator of human rights abuses in civil society as well. When we see these abuses, we have an obligation to take action. Russian authorities destroyed families and stripped adoptive parents of their children on mere suspicions. Human rights monitors reported that in 2017, men were rounded up in Chiknua based on their suspected sexual orientation and were beaten and tortured, some to death. Human rights activists in Russia have suffered wrongful imprisonment, physical assault, and egregious intimidation by the state for standing up for their friends and family. These actions run contrary to our own nation's ideals of tolerance and diversity. And in the face of hate-based incidents, we must stand together, resolute in the pursuit of justice. No person should ever feel threatened based on who they are, what they believe, or who they love. Basic rights and human dignity are at the core of American values, and it should remain the top priority of our foreign policy objectives. While we take this month to celebrate advancements made in civil rights throughout the United States, we must work to actively combat intolerance and stand together to promote equality and dignity for all. I will tell you, I will continue to do so throughout my tenure in Congress. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to do the same. And I'm glad the subcommittee has recognized the value of this issue. I'm grateful for our witnesses being here and look forward to your testimony today. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I'd like to thank the ranking member for his remarks, and I'd like to now turn to Representative Cicilline, the chair of the LGBTQI Plus Equality Caucus, for a 3-minute opening statement. Representative Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to you and to the ranking member for calling this really important hearing as we gather to reaffirm our commitment to advocate on behalf of those that are increasingly persecuted and marginalized because of who they are, who they love, and how they identify. Without that commitment, we risk not the rights only of LGBTQI people. We risk not just democracy for LGBTQI plus people. We risk not just the safety and security of LGBTQI people. We risk it for all people. As chair of the Congressional LGBTQ Equality Caucus, I hope today will serve as a marker on a path back to American, European, and global leadership on human rights for all. 30 years ago, much of Eastern and Central Europe threw off the shackles of oppression and chartered a future that sought freedoms for all the peoples of Europe, a future in which human rights and democracy would define a continent that had been suppressed by the unrelenting despair of decades of tyranny and oppression. For many, that optimism has been replaced by a sense of fear that even in parts of Europe today, they cannot truly be free from discrimination, persecution, or violence. In Poland, LGBTQI plus people must live in fear in LGBTQI plus free zones that deny them their very humanity. In Hungary, Viktor Orban scapegoats the LGBTQI plus community to continue his assaults on the freedoms of Hungarians. In Ukraine, the future of democracy and the rule of law is imperiled by the prospect of Russian-backed legislation that would deny the rights of Ukraine's LGBTQI plus population. In Chechnya, LGBTQI plus people must live underground for fear of being abducted and tortured by authorities. It is perhaps unsurprising then that many of these states are also democratic laggards that have seen basic civil liberties like freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, and the rights to voice political opposition curtailed. The mistake some risk making is viewing the regression of the human rights of LGBTQI people in these states as an issue that affects just one group of people. Our own recent history here in the United States has taught us that political opportunists will never stop finding a new scapegoat. So let us remind ourselves of fundamental truths. The violence against any people because of who they are is a violence against all people. An injustice against any people who how they identify is an injustice against all people, that discrimination against any person is intolerable and cannot stand, and that equality is the indispensable tool for advancing the rights of all peoples everywhere. And Mr. Chairman, through legislation like the Global Respect Act and the GLOBE Act, we can once again demonstrate our commitment to leading on behalf of some of the world's most vulnerable people. I thank you again for calling this hearing and look forward to working with you, my colleagues on this subcommittee, and all of our colleagues in the House to protect the rights of a few so that we may protect the rights of all. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Cicilline. Thank you for your leadership. I'll now introduce our witnesses, and I thank you all for being here today. Beyond Venda Rosendahl, I apologize, is the Program Director for ILGA Europe. Svetlana Sakharova is the Co-Secretary for ILGA Europe and a board member at the Russian LGBT Network. Tomasz Dombush is a board member at the Haider Institute in Hungary, and Dr. Lenny Emerson is the director of the NGO Keep Pride in Ukraine. I'll now recognize the witnesses for 5 minutes each, and without objection, your prepared written statements will be made part of the record. Mr. Van Roosendaal, you're now recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Keating, for the initiative of this hearing, and thank you, Ranking Member Fitzpatrick and Representative Vicini for all of the work that you're doing in this area. I appreciate the initiative for this hearing today and your interest in the situation of LGBTI rights in Europe and Central Asia. It comes at a critical time, as unfortunately there is widespread and almost complete stagnation on the human rights of LGBTI people in the region. COVID-19 seems to have become an excuse to advance LGBTI rights in many countries. I want to give a few examples. Civil society space has been shrinking in countries like Poland, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, Turkey, often limiting possibilities for LGBTI activists to exercise their human rights work. The Uzbeki government continues to penalize same-sex conduct between men, and it is high time that the criminal law is abolished. The impact of anti-trans sentiments is unfortunately felt across the region, not just only in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, but also in places where historically more progress on LGBTI rights was made, like the United Kingdom, as well as Scandinavian countries. These sentiments are not just conceptual debates on the notion of gender. Unfortunately, they deeply impact LGBTI people in their everyday lives. Organizations from across the region have reported over the last year increasing hatred online, but also in the streets. Whilst legal protections against violence and discrimination exist in many countries, there unfortunately also remain too many gaps. Hate crime laws are absent not just in countries like Armenia and Slovenia, but also in Germany and Ireland. And we see the implementation of existing procedures on legal gender recognition worsening, including in places like Georgia, Spain, and Serbia. Distinguished members of this House, some countries in Europe once may have been the beacon of hope for LGBTI rights globally. But we have learned that progress made in our work towards equality provide no guarantees for the future. COVID-19 seems to have become an excuse for too many leaders in government in making progress on providing protection and equality through law, or to speak out to rising anti-LGBTI sentiments. It would be easy to blame it all on political attention being immersed in the public health response to COVID-19 and the ensuing economic fallout. But the reality is a lot more complex. In too many countries, progress is stopped because there is increased political polarization on LGBTI issues and because governments don't see it as a political issue, as a priority issue. LGBTI organizations are at the very center of these developments. Currently, and often as a result of COVID, many provide humanitarian support to their communities as governments fail to provide basic needs. In a context of rising opposition, providing security and emergent protection has become ever more important in the work. With scarce resources and fading political attention, too many activists struggle to balance the need to provide support to their communities whilst keeping afloat the political work to advance LGBTI rights. The US State Department and US Aid have been financially and politically supportive towards the work of LGBTI movements globally for several years and with bipartisan support. It is critically important that this funding and political support continues, that the funding increases, and that it continues to focus on the European and Central Asian regions. And it is important that these efforts continue to be prioritized and integrated in wider efforts to support anti-democratic developments. Thankfully, in these difficult times, European institutions have stepped up their work to support LGBTI rights. The EU last year adopted the LGBTI equality strategy, which includes an extensive plan of action on many fronts. The European Parliament, as was already said, like this House, undertakes cross-party action to advance the rights of LGBTI people in the EU, but also globally. And the Council of Europe has created an anti-discrimination steering committee, which works on sexual orientation and gender identity as part of its mandate. In a time where working in alliances is ever more important, there is political capital to work with on both sides of the Atlantic. For the US government, the European institutions are important partners to work with, not just for the promotion of LGBTI rights in foreign policy, but also by cooperating to strengthen human rights at home, which, given the growing polarization, I think is an important dimension in doing this work successfully, as it builds political credibility to this important work. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Van Roosendaal. And now I'll recognize Ms. Zakharova, I apologize, for your opening statement. Ms. Zakharova.
Thank you, Chair Keating, Ranking Member Fitzpatrick, representatives. My name is Svetlana Zakharova. I am a lesbian, a feminist, and a human rights defender from Russia. I work with the Russian LGBT Network since 2014, and Russian LGBT Network, it is the biggest organization in the country that fight for equal rights for everyone, regardless of sexual orientation and gender identity. Last December, I became the director of the Legal and Social Support Charitable Foundation Sphere, organization operator of the Russian LGBT Network. I am grateful for this opportunity to testify before the subcommittee, especially today. Exactly that day, 8 years ago, the so-called propaganda law was adopted in Russia at federal level. This legislation is really bad in many ways, but I think that the trickiest thing about this legislation is the fact that it does not define what exactly propaganda means. And as a result, every judge or state official or even police officer decide by himself or herself if the particular case is propaganda or not. The truth is this legislation is not really used widely, but it creates an atmosphere of impunity for the perpetrators. Those people who commit hate crimes, they believe that they're doing the right thing. They believe that there are authorities behind them. And LGBT plus community on the other side feel targeted, vulnerable, and unprotected. The consequences of this legislation are numerous. Open public discussion about LGBT plus rights in Russia is almost impossible. LGBT minors do not get any support because psychologists and social workers are just afraid to work with them. They're afraid of being accused of propaganda. Online resources related to LGBT plus issues are being blocked. The amount of hate crimes is growing. Freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and freedom of assembly are violated. And the extreme case is what's happening in Chechnya, where LGBT people are deprived of the very basic right, the right to life. In 2017, the whole world learned that LGBT plus people in Chechnya are being kidnapped, tortured, and even killed just because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. We started to support those people in 2017, and we still are doing that because it is far from being over. Actually, I planned to devote my testimony to the ways LGBT plus community in Russia is growing and getting stronger despite of all the pressure and everything that is going on in the country. I wanted to talk about the ways how public opinion is changing to the better because of the works of all the organizations and people who are working hardly every day to do so. But yesterday happened something that changed my testimony completely. Last night, the shelter for victims of the domestic violence in Makhachkala, Dagestan, was attacked by the law enforcement agencies. Several women, including Svetlana Anokhina, a human rights defender, were brutally detained. They are still detained for no reasons but helping other women. We believe that this shelter was attacked because Halimat Taramova was there. Recently, she contacted the Russian LGBT network, and she said that her life is in mortal danger because of her sexual orientation. With her girlfriend, she managed to leave Chechnya. She went to Dagestan, Makhachkala, and she was in the shelter. She was waiting for the relocation to the safer place. But basically, she was kidnapped by the law enforcement agencies. She was taken back to Chechnya, and probably she was given to her parents. We do not know if she is alive. Her girlfriend was released today. She managed to contact us and to tell us what really happened. She is out of Dagestan now. Such situation is just unbelievable. The law enforcement agencies are attacking shelters for the victims of the domestic violence and kidnap people they should protect. It happened in Russia right now, and I want to point your attention to that and to the ways how some people in Russia are deprived from this very basic right, the right to life. We all know that our presidents are going to meet soon, and I believe that the situation with LGBT plus rights in Russia, in Chechnya, and especially the fate of Hamilat Taramova should be discussed. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Zakharova. The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes, Mr. Dumbush.
Chairman Keating, members of the subcommittee, I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you about the gross violations of human rights of LGBTQI people in Hungary. My testimony today is in my capacity as board member of Háttér Society and the Hungarian LGBT Alliance. Historically speaking, Hungary was a country with a relatively high level of acceptance and legal protections afforded to sexual and gender minorities. The country decriminalized homosexuality in 1961. The first gay association was set up before the end of socialism. The law recognizes same-sex couples since 1996. Transgender people had access to legal gender recognition. Budapest, our lovely capital, hosted the first ever Pride March in the region more than 2 decades ago in 1997. In the past decade, and especially in the past 2 years, however, the legal, social, and political situation of LGBTQI people has severely deteriorated. It started with the adoption of a new constitution in 2012. It contains a provision that defines marriage as a union between a woman and a man, and family only with reference to marriage and parent-child relationships. Since then, our families have lived in a legal vacuum. Governmental homophobia and transphobia reached a new peak in 2019 when high-ranking public officials, governing politicians, and overwhelmingly government-controlled public and private media started to speak in an unprecedentedly hostile way about our community. The Speaker of the Parliament likened same-sex couples raising children to pedophiles. Prime Minister Orbán said homosexuals should keep their hands off our children. A senior member of parliament called for banning our Pride March and for boycotting Coca-Cola as they featured a same-sex couple in an advertisement. But the attacks did not stop at words. Last May, the parliament banned legal gender recognition for trans and intersex people. Trans people now have to live with official documents that do not reflect their gender identity and or their appearance. In December 2020, the parliament restricted adoption by non-married couples, non-married persons. It will no longer be professionals, but rather a politician, our openly homophobic Minister of Family Affairs, who will make decisions on who is a suitable parent. Most recently, just yesterday, an amendment was introduced in parliament copying the infamous Russian propaganda law. The amendment would ban discussions on homosexuality and trans persons in schools, ban advertisements portraying gay and lesbian couples, and sanction shops selling books or movies featuring LGBTQI people to minors. And we're not talking about the portrayal of sexual relations, but any portrayal of a gay or lesbian person, a same-sex couple, or a transgender person. Most of these legislative changes happened during the peak of the COVID crisis, when hundreds of people were dying every day. All these changes form part of a very conscious and diabolic political strategy to divert attention away from the inability of the government to tackle the health, social, and economic crisis COVID brought to our country. While these discussions were happening in parliament, extreme right-wing paramilitary groups felt encouraged to disrupt our work in illegal ways. Dozens of Nazis regularly come to our events, not just the Pride March, but movie screenings, workshops, discussions. They threaten the participants, physically abuse the organizers, steal or burn our rainbow flags, and the police offer no protection. We are sad, angry, and fearful. The rights we have fought for so hard for so long can be taken away from us at a glimpse of a moment. We have become tools in a political game. We became enemy number one just because of the way we love or the way we identify. Don't be misled by the government's propaganda. The majority of Hungarians are not homophobes or transphobes. The majority agrees with legal equality for LGBTQI people, with legal gender recognition for trans people, with same-sex couples being a family. These are facts of public opinion polls. We are not threatened by our society. We are threatened by a political leadership that creates and fights false enemies instead of governing the country. A political leadership that completely disregards not only its international obligations, but binding court decisions. If they don't agree with a court ruling, they change the law the next day. They abolish checks and balances, dismantle democratic institutions, filled up our courts and public bodies with their friends. The problems we face do not only target us as LGBTQI persons, they target us as human rights defenders, as independent civil society actors, as autonomous citizens. But we do not give up. We will fight our legal battles and we will protect our community from these attacks. We will make sure that every person understands how living in such a hostile political environment undermines our everyday existence, our mental, physical well-being. And we will make sure that our country finds its way back to a community of democracies built on the respect for human rights, equality, and the rule of law. But we need your help as well. You have to hold our government accountable to its international human rights commitments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dumbosh. I'd now like to call on Dr. Emson for your opening statement. Dr.
Chair
Emson.
Keating, Ranking Member Fitzpatrick, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify on this important issue during the Pride months. I represent an NGO that annually organizes the largest LGBTI rally in Ukraine, Kyiv Pride March of Equality. Back in 2013, the Kyiv Pride March began as a short walk of about 50 people and took place in the outskirts of the city. It was tremendously hard to make sure the authorities didn't ban it to ensure our protection from groups opposing equal rights. In just 6 years, the Kyiv Pride March has transformed into a massive rally of more than 10,000 people taking place in central Kyiv in 2019. The striking difference in numbers within a span of just a few years demonstrates the progress our society has made in terms of respecting and protecting LGBTI rights. This progress would have not been possible without the consistent support of the United States. The efforts to strengthen Ukraine's police reform and civil society were not in vain. However, some very serious challenges remain for our community. Our increased visibility has sparked a surge in the numbers of hate crimes against LGBTI people. Violent groups advocating hatred began targeting us. They often come to our events and do whatever they can to disrupt them, including resorting to violence. These groups are operating in an organized manner. They are easy to identify, but they enjoy near total impunity for their attacks. Today, several right radical NGOs are clearly visible and acting in many cities of the country. In 2020, they've organized several attacks on LGBTI community centers and events, such as Odessa Pride, when a dozen of participants was attacked and injured. In 2021, the community center of the LGBT association Liga has received bomb threats twice. These actions are widely supported by many Ukrainian politicians and MPs, and the number of attacks on LGBTI activities by far-right groups has sharply increased, 24 cases in 2020 against 11 in 2019. Just within the last week of May this year, there have been 4 such attacks, including one attack on a Kyiv Pride organized film screening. Every time we have to live in fear of yet another attack. Unfortunately, the police are not doing nearly enough to address such attacks and hold the perpetrators accountable. Currently, Ukraine doesn't explicitly recognize homophobia as motives of a hate crime in its legislation. This issue is invisible for the state. Holding perpetrators accountable, even without acknowledging hate motive, is also incredibly rare. In one emblematic case of activist Vitalina Koval, People who threw paint at her and caused chemical burns to her eyes were charged with causing her minor bodily harm and were brought before court. The court was looking into her case for almost 3 years and yet failed to prosecute Vitilinikola's attackers because of an expired statute of limitations for such crimes. The lack of legislation that recognizes homophobia and transphobia as types of discriminatory motives, as well as the lack of effective investigations, is what keeps pulling our country back in terms of LGBTI rights progress. The good news is our government has recently registered a bill that will introduce the reform of the anti-hate crime legislation. We expect this bill to be widely opposed, and so we would like to ask for solidarity from the international community. Our members of parliament should be urged that this reform is necessary. I would also like to emphasize that even if we would have the most perfect law addressing hate crimes, this law would still have to be implemented. That is why any kind of support to continue Ukraine's police reform is most welcome. In 2013, the Kyiv Pride March for Equality took place largely because of the international support from governments, embassies, and allied organizations. Today, civil society in Ukraine needs that same support in order to ensure that legal reform continues and that these acts of violence against the LGBTI community are rightly considered hate crimes and are prosecuted as such. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Emson, and thank all of you for your testimony. I'll now recognize members for 5 minutes each pursuant to House rules. All time yielded is for the purposes of questioning witnesses. Because of the virtual format of this hearing, I'll recognize members of the committee by seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. If you miss your turn, please let our staff know, and we'll circle back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair verbally. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. And I want to thank the witnesses. I think you all did a very good job of showing how the connection with LGBTQI plus rights, these basic civil rights, the deterioration of that coincides with other types of democratic backsliding. One of the issues, whether it's rule of law, whether it's the enforcement by police or law enforcement, security people, or the judiciary. I just want to start with one question, and I think it was Mr. Dombush that brought this up, but one of the areas of backsliding that are concerned are what's happening in these authoritarian countries with the media. Could you all comment on how they're using the media to really tamp down these basic human rights and the kind of things they're doing? I think that we see what they're doing in Russia now with the foreign agents legislation. We're seeing the effect on Radio Free Europe. We're seeing it on Medusa and other sources. So could you share with us just how this is happening and what kind of a threat it presents? Anyone that would like to start with that would be great. Yes.
Chair Keating, I would like to start. Well, you started to talk about Russia, and I myself from Russia. And Charitable Foundation Sphere, I am the director of, is actually in the list of foreign agents since 2016. So I know exactly how it is to be a foreign agent. And talking about mass media, most mass media in Russia are still state-controlled, and it is really hard to go to them and to present a different image of LGBT plus community. And most of them portray LGBT plus community as pedophiles, as foreign agents, as people who want to destroy our traditional values, whatever it is supposed to mean. But of course, we have support from the independent mass media, and we are really grateful for this support because it's almost the only channel for us to talk about LGBT rights. Thank you.
Would anyone else want to comment on that? I have another question. In a parliamentary system, unlike our own, we're finding in very close elections, the coalitions coming together that are formed after those elections often rely on small minority parties to give them coalition majority. Are you seeing some of the far right groups that are actually attacking these basic human rights, forming these coalitions, and what kind of influence do they have, albeit a small minority, but also leveraging that for a coalition? Do you see any of that occurring in these small parties? Mr. Dumbush.
Yeah, just first to react to the media. Currently in Hungary, the media is under strict governmental control. Yes, there is private media, but many of the private media has been bought by pro-government businessmen with the help of loans from the government. And the public media and all these pro-government media are micromanaged. They are told what messages to send, which people to invite. Just to give you an example, a few months ago, I was invited to the public radio for a discussion about a specific topic. We set up an interview, and 15 minutes later, I get a phone call saying that, I'm sorry, we cannot have that interview because you appear on the list of banned persons. And so there is an official list in the public radio about organizations and people that they cannot invite. I mean, that's the level of oppression in the media that happens. And regarding the second question, in Hungary, I think the most extremist political party currently is Fidesz. It's the governing party. We've had Jobbik, an extreme right-wing party that, compared to Fidesz now, is a moderate centrist party. Over the past 10 years, month after month, the government has become more xenophobic, racist, and most recently, completely LGBTQI phobic. They create now a fake party, Mihazánk, and they play into the hand of this extremist party so that they can claim that they are not the most extreme one. But don't be fooled by it. This is a political game. They created a party that is that seems to be more extremist than them, so that they can claim that they are a centrist moderate party, and if they are not in power, then the Nazis will come in. Those Nazis are them. They are financing them. They are giving them media space. And create this image that they are the moderate centrist parties. That's a lie.
Thank you so much for that. I now recognize Representative Deutsch for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for calling this really important and I think we can say historic hearing. On our committee, I'm just glad that I'm one of several members of the Congressional LGBTQ+ Equality Caucus, including our caucus chair, Mr. Cicilline. The caucus and this committee share a common understanding of the United States' responsibility to stand up for equality and human rights for the LGBTQ+ community does not stop at our borders. And this month in particular, we stand in international solidarity not only with our own LGBTQ+ constituents here, but with communities around the world. And as this hearing has already demonstrated, the right of every person to have equal opportunity, regardless of gender or sexual orientation, regardless of who they love or their gender presentation, is an unequivocal part of our nation's human rights vision and correspondingly of our nation's foreign policy. So I'm really grateful to all the witnesses and to you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this important hearing. I want to, Mr. Chair, I want to follow up on your question about democratic backsliding, and we've talked about this before. And in recent years, the backsliding we've seen across Europe and Eurasia has created a space for increased discrimination against the LGBTQ+ community. And Hungary and Poland are certainly a particular concern with rapid democratic deterioration and codified reversals in progress for the community. Mr. Dumbush, your last response about Fidesz creating a party so that they can appear to be the moderate party, I think is a really troubling part of this conversation. But there's a trend here. And so what I'd ask all of our panelists, if you could put this, the struggles for and the attacks on the LGBTQ+ community in the broader context of the deterioration of democratic institutions across Europe and Eurasia. How does this fit in? And Mr. Damos, you had made reference to this specifically when you include this as part of the greater human rights struggle. How does the backsliding in your country? I'll start with you, and then we'll open up to everyone. How does it wind up? How does it wind up impacting the community specifically when you see this democratic backsliding taking place?
Well, I think the reaction of most people is to just run away, either like completely closing out politics from their lives because every morning you get up and you read a statement like that, or they run out of the country. I mean, we are in the EU, unlike Ukraine and Russia, so it is a right of any citizen to just leave the country and live in another country, and that's what's happening. After the trans law was adopted, dozens and dozens of my trans friends left the country from one day to the other because they said they don't want to live in a country that denies them the basic right to be who they are and to have the name they want. And yes, I think it is very important to notice that LGBTQI people are just one among many other groups that are targeted. We are currently targeted the most in Hungary, but a few years ago it was homeless people, it was migrants, it was George Soros with very clear anti-Semitic tones. So this is the logic of the government, to find an enemy and then pretend that they are saving the country from that enemy. And unfortunately, since they have 2/3 majority, they can do whatever they want with legislation. They can change the constitution from one day to the other. They can, if they don't like what a certain public body is doing, they just abolish the public body. So they don't fire the person. They just abolish the public body. This is what happened with the data protection ombuds that we had.
I appreciate that, Mr. Damos. I just want to give.
Yeah, sure.
I would just like to provide an opportunity for the other witnesses. Maybe Ms. Zakharova, can I ask you to comment on this?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Representative Dovich. As well as Hungary, in Russia, LGBT is not the only targeted group. And it is very clear to me that it is part of civil society. And all civil society is really oppressed. And we could see how it was when the legislation on the foreign agents were adopted. And we are now in the same box. Basically, there is only one party and Russia, and all the rest are considered to be as opposition, and opposition is oppressed.
No, I appreciate it. Mr. Keating, I hope we'll get to hear from the other witnesses on this as well, but I'm out of time, so I'll yield back. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative. We might have time for a second round too, so if you're interested in pursuing that, we'll do it. To the witnesses, I will say this, that when you answer the question, you don't have to be recognized unless the member designates a question directly for you. So feel free to jump in with the questions unless there's a appointed designation. So with that, I'm going to recognize Representative Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again for this historic hearing. And thank you to the witnesses for being here. Happy Pride. Thank you for your heroic work around the world. As I was listening to the testimony, it struck me that, there must be a set of conditions in places in Europe and Eurasia that are leading, politicians and state actors to conclude that supporting anti-LGBTQ parties is in their best interest. And so I wonder if you speak to kind of what are the social, economic, and political conditions that are contributing to that, and what are the long-term implications of being prevented from providing positive representations of LGBTQI people, particularly to young people, and kind of the next generation of attitudes. But what's causing this? I think Dr. Damos, you said this is part of a strategy to divert attention from failed economic policies by rallying people around someone that they can create as a villain. I just wonder what are the conditions that you're seeing that are leading to this?
If I may.
Dr. Damos, you want to start?
Yeah. All right, thank you for your question because it's a very important issue for our countries, and I believe poverty is a big issue, and economical pressure that people feel, and governments is really looking for some reason and looking for the channel where they can put people's anger, right? And governments in our countries, they really looking at LGBTI people as a group that can be really attacked without any consequences for attackers, right? In our country, for example, and after the pandemic crisis, right, the situation is really not easy. And today we have a lot of young people, new generation, that are really transphobic, that are really homophobic, and are really aggressive towards LGBTQI people. And they gather in groups, they gather even in registered organizations, and they attack LGBTQI events, LGBTQI people, and even people who are not belonging to LGBTQI communities, but like look like LGBT, right? So people who look not normal, right? People who are different from the majority of the society. And this is a very, very scary situation right now, because as my colleagues said before, it's not only about LGBTQI group. We are very visible. That's why we are attacked. But this anger is directed on many more groups like Roma people, like homeless people, and other groups that are not protected. And unfortunately, the government doesn't think about protecting them and about really making the country a safe place for everyone, which is really important for us right now. Thank you.
So can I ask any of the witnesses, I think one of the things that the purpose of this hearing is to think about ways that the United States can partner with our European allies or European institutions like the Council of Europe to promote LGBT equality and dignity. And obviously, passing the Equality Act and passing some legislation that will reaffirm our commitment to the principles of equality for our community is one thing. But what other things can we do as the United States Congress to support the work that you are doing? I mean, we're very conscious of not, in many countries, so much of the argument is this is about Western ideas being imported to poison society and destroy your way of life. So we're very sensitive on the way we do it, and we want to be smart about it. But what kinds of things can the United States Congress do to help support LGBTQ plus equality in places where you live and work right now? Bjorn, I think you're on.
Sorry, if I can come in there, I think that legally, indeed, and when we look at Europe, a lot of progress has been made, and some of you have said it earlier. There is a limited amount of work that is possible in that space, albeit it continues to be important, of course, to address situations like in Hungary. Like in Russia. I think beyond that, what is important is that we look at how hearts and minds can be won. And in order for that to happen, I think what needs to happen is first strengthening a joint political commitment between countries, and that is where a lot of work needs to happen. And then I think also in doing that, looking at what kind of programming can happen across both sides of the Atlantic. That supports the work that LGBTI movements are doing in winning hearts and minds. And there, I think the Global Equality Fund has played a very detrimental role already. But its contribution to the work is still, compared to what other countries do, I think limited. So continuing to grow that, and not just by the work that the State Department is doing, but also the work that USAID is doing, I think is important. And within that, also paying attention to the work that happens in places in Europe.
Thank you so much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative. The chair recognizes Representative Titus for her questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. It's been a long time since the Foreign Affairs Committee addressed this topic, and I think it's a crying shame that our colleagues from across the aisle couldn't find the time or have the concern to join us to hear about this issue. I appreciate everything the witnesses have been saying, and as they may or may not know, we've just recently introduced the GLOBE Act to try to restore the U.S.'s leadership position in this area. So I hope that we'll see some movement on that and have the State Department again start to take the lead. We've also seen that COVID has made situations worse for groups that have traditionally, I guess, been discriminated against already. I wonder if y'all might address if you've seen any of the restrictions because of COVID been disproportionately applied to your community.
Yes, clearly. Of course, I think all the political developments that have been happening, I think, are also in the context of COVID, as I mentioned, but it has also direct impact on people.
Right.
People were not able to access HIV testing. They were not able to access medication. Transgender surgeries or hormonal treatment were canceled because of COVID. Many LGBTQI people had to move back to their families' homes, families that are not necessarily supportive of them. This often put people in danger of domestic abuse on behalf of their parents or their siblings. Many people lost their jobs because of COVID, and many LGBTQI people live already in informal sectors, and then they get no protection whatsoever. So I think it is true that we are among one of the biggest losers of the COVID crisis. Thank you.
If I may add it to this. So last year, one of the leaders of the Ukrainian Church, Orthodox Church, he declared that COVID happened because of gay people, just for you to see, you know. Well, and I would support my colleague from Hungary because like many people lost their jobs and many people need more support right now, and specifically people with HIV positive status, right? Because they really need more support and we need more testing and we need more support for this group, right? And in terms of LGBTQI rights, the situation is worsening as well because the government just used COVID and crisis as an excuse, right, for banning us from advocating our rights right on the spot. Thank you.
I've seen across the region that LGBTI groups have started to increase the kind of service provision, direct service provision that they do towards the LGBTI community, providing food, shelter, medical support in places where governments were hugely absent in providing the kind of services that LGBTI people need. So I can say that in most places, unfortunately, governments have not met the space to think about the specific needs that the LGBTI community may need. And so at the time of global backlash, I think it's fair to say that LGBTI organizations have not only been overwhelmed with responding to that backlash, but also stepped up the ways in which they have to take care of the community. And how that is affecting LGBTI organizations is hugely important to name as well, because we see, unfortunately, a lot of cases of burnout, well-being issues with human rights defenders who simply have too many things to work on an everyday basis. When you compare, and it's just to put a number to it, when you compare the level of funding between North America and Europe, we're at 1/10 of the amount of funding that is going around in the LGBTI movement in this region compared to our colleagues in the US and Canada. So you can imagine that there's a situation of a significant under-resourcing, which really affects so many activists in the movement at the moment as a result.
Oh, I'm sure that's true. Not only is the problem worse, but the strain on the agencies trying to deal with the problem outside of government must be so great. Well, right now, our president is traveling in Europe and is announcing that he's going to have an international vaccine plan. So, Mr. Chairman, maybe we can send a letter encouraging him where he distributes this vaccine to our allies, that we are sure that all communities are included, including especially LGBTQ communities. Thank you, and I'll wait till the next round for another question.
Yeah. Thank you, Representative. That's a great suggestion, and I appreciate that. Now I'll just quickly have a second round of questions, if we could. I'm just curious, as we're talking about the control of the media, when we're talking about the way it's being manipulated, when instances occur, and in our own country, we have instances of discrimination that make the press. Is that used at all, by these other authoritarian countries where they highlight this as occurring in the U.S. or other democratic countries? Do you see that occurring at all as part of the media control and newspaper control? Anyone that might have seen that?
Yeah, I think this mapping of homosexuality or LGBTQI activity as coming from the West is very common. But I think it's, at least in the case of Hungary, you have to understand that Hungarians are very pro-Western in their attitudes. If you look at the public opinion polls about support for European Union membership or trust in EU institutions, the trust is way, way higher in EU institutions and European institutions than it is in the Hungarian government. So I think it is very important to understand that yes, there is that, but that should not debilitate making a clear point about LGBTQI equality. And I think it's also very important to emphasize that, unfortunately, much of the conservative kind of family values, gender ideology discourse is coming from the US and is sponsored by the United States bodies. Evangelical churches, clear conservative groups that are losing out in their own country, and they export their homophobic and transphobic views in other countries. We've seen this all over the world in the past 2 decades in African countries, and it is currently happening in Hungary. I mean, our homophobic Minister of Family Affairs is regularly attending these meetings with US evangelicals, as well as with Russian strategists that are trying to build on an international level a coalition of conservative, family-oriented countries and groups. And then, of course, they impact how policies and decisions are made in Hungary.
Well, thank you for that comment, because I think it really underscores the importance of our committee having this hearing and the fact that this is an international issue, not just a domestic issue. I think there's part of authoritarianism is the idea that, they're closed to other borders, they make their own decisions, they have their own. But this is truly international. And you mentioned Hungary again. The polls taken there are quite clear, very high. 79, 80% of the people believe these issues are private matters. But still, Orban is able to do what he's doing. How is he getting away with manipulating that with such a strong population in support of keeping this a private human rights issue?
I think the reason is that they are very professional in polling people and finding issues where you have a slightly less support. So that's why they picked on transgender people. That's why they picked on adoption issue. That's why they're picking up on school education now, because those are the topics that many Hungarians feel a bit less secure about and more uncomfortable about. Also, those issues are very often, unfortunately, the ones which are not covered by the European Union law. So they are, freer to venture into those areas. And they don't have to convince every single Hungarian. They only have to convince those very loyal supporters that they need to take to the polls. And that's how they're working. They know, each and every person basically that votes for them. And they target them, micro-target them with very clear messages that resonate with what they think about the world. And unfortunately, with some groups in society, this kind of homophobia and transphobia resonates very well with their fears.
Are you finding this is for any of the panel, we've talked a great deal about the free speech, freedom of assembly, the ability to speak up, those type of freedoms too, but are you seeing in these countries where this kind of repression is occurring, issues like housing and employment being affected too? I mean, our Equality Act that we're passing here protects housing issues, employment issues, issues of getting loans and financing. But are you seeing housing? What other areas are you seeing this discrimination really spread to.
Do you still have time?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yes, okay. If I may, I would reply to this because housing is a big issue for LGBTQI people in Ukraine specifically, like I believe in other countries in the region, because people, in order to rent a house or a flat, right, they need to hide themselves, right? We cannot be visible. We cannot be open. If you are open, you stand no chance for getting rent or getting apartment. It's a big problem because the legislation does not mention any of discriminated groups in terms of protecting their right for housing or for food or for employment, right? We don't have this in our legislation, and unfortunately, this really affects LGBTQI people in the country.
Any other comments in that regard?
Yeah,
I'll work. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I'm sorry. No, that there's an increasing body of research around homelessness, in particular amongst LGBTI young people in the region, and unfortunately, the numbers that are coming in have very stark similarities between what we see in the US. So there's huge instances of homelessness amongst young people who often can no longer stay with their parents and then sleep rough because they have no place to go to. In the field of employment, I would say the European Union and its 27 member states have laws that the anti-discrimination laws to employment, but the implementation thereof often fails, and in too many neighboring countries that is not the case. And so what we see is also in recent years that the growing number of LGBTI community members needs to turn to litigation to get their rights recognized in also a lot of the Council of Europe countries. So this is still a huge body of work, I think, in the field of socio-economic rights, where a lot of needs are there, but also a lot of I think opportunities for the LGBTI movement to work on.
Great, thank you, Representative Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Zakharova, I hope I pronounced it correctly. The Russian Federation is obviously a global leader in the persecution of LGBTQI plus persons and persuades nations and individuals within its sphere of influence to adopt their hateful doctrine as their own. Activists face violence and detention. Vladimir Putin regularly articulates his disdain not just for equality for the LGBTQI community in Russia, but for human rights in general. And the Russian government, as you know, has failed to adequately address targeted criminal acts against Russia's LGBTQI community. And my question is, in that context, what role does social media and enhanced tech monitoring play in anti-LGBTQI harassment and violence, both by private citizens and by national and regional governments like those in Chechnya?
Well, thank you for this question. And I would say that social networks and technologies is a double-sided thing, because on the one hand, it is a source of, for many people, it is a source of information, especially for many young people. And I can see how, like, young people in Russia are different from us. For instance, like several years ago, there was a public poll opinion, and more than 50% of school children, people who were basically targeted by this propaganda law, said they actually support same-sex marriages, therefore totally for that. But at the same time, of course, quite often the same networks are used against LGBT plus community, especially in such close communities and in Chechnya, where people like literally cannot be open. It is dangerous. It threatens their lives. And of course, local authorities use their vulnerability, and well, it is something that is happening, and I think that probably international business should pay more attention to security in such countries like Russia, and especially such regions as Chechnya.
Thank you. Dr. Emerson, you know, I think a lot of people are watching with some concern that in Ukraine, the ultra-conservative far right is retaining a lot of influence and a lot of power, risking not only the rights of LGBTQI people, but also Ukraine's democratic future. And it's been reported that anti-LGBTQI plus legislation, including legislation introduced by members of President Zelensky's own party, has been circulated in Ukraine that closely resembles initiatives either introduced or enacted in Russia. And I wonder how much the influence does Russia have over the debate for LGBTQI plus people in Ukraine, and what you see the prospects for that law.
Thank you very much for this question, because this is a very important issue as well. Right now is Russian influence, right? So since 2012, right, we have experienced these efforts of different political parties to introduce the K propaganda law in Ukraine, right? And last year was an attempt, and we know that some MPs getting ready to introduce it again and again. And we know there's political parties that are standing behind this efforts. And moreover, it's not only about the legislation, it's about the far-right groups that we believe partly financed by Russian government or Russian security forces. And they train these groups, and they really put a lot of effort in raising these groups inside Ukraine. And homophobia and transphobia is a big issue because of this Russian influence. And young people right now in Ukraine, some of them are really under this influence, and we're afraid that this influence is growing. Unfortunately, this is very big. This is not only the Ukrainian government or MPs, right? This is the propaganda that goes from all sources, like media, like social media, like money that are really spread into this far-right groups growing.
Yeah, I want to just get in one quick question, Dr. Donbass. You know, when you were talking about using particular issues like the transgender community, adoption, and school issues, we see the same things in the United States for organizations that are opposing our fight for full equality. I wonder if you just speak a little more about the role of U.S. groups and these evangelical groups, because I think this is really alarming. You know, we're always accused of exporting, you know, tolerance for the LGBTQ community, acceptance, and what you're saying is just the opposite. The U.S. is exporting some pretty, you know, some organizations that are promoting undermining equality for our community, and I think we need to know more about that.
Exactly. The World Congress of Families, for example, which is a hate group recognized by the Southern Poverty Law Center, they are, you know, have done several conferences in Hungary. They are inviting, you know, public speakers, and you know, they try to sell it as like a support for family values, but it's very clearly an anti-LGBTQI and anti-women's rights, anti-sexual and reproductive health rights coalition that is putting a lot of effort, money, and know-how as well in how to do this. What topics to look at, how to frame topics. And I think of course, the reason why they are so similar is partly because, you know, humans all over the world have similar fears. They are afraid for their children. You know, they want the best for their children. So if you're telling them that, oh, these monster trans freaks are gonna turn your child into a trans person that you will never recognize, and you will lose your son or lose your daughter, then people resonate with this. But it is also not just this, you know, basic human mentality, but also, you know, very clear networks that are being put in place, and policy learning, unfortunately, is taking place in its worst way. We see you know, amendments to Hungarian constitution popping up in other countries. We see the propaganda law introduced in Hungary copying Russia. Unfortunately, there is policy learning among these countries to the worse.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative. Now I'll recognize for the final questions, the chief sponsor of the GLOBE Act, Representative Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you look back at the history of LGBT rights in this country, you find that much of that started at the state level. The Congress was kind of late to get on board. We had initiatives at the state level, state legislatures passed equality laws or marriage laws. And then when they reached the tipping point, Congress came on board. I realize that y'all don't have the same kind of federal system or maybe even referenda or initiatives like we do here, but have you had any luck at trying to deal with lower levels of government like communities or states or regions, working your way up to the national level? Is that a possibility where you all are?
Can I start answering this question? I think that in Russia, political process is quite different. There is only one ruling party, and basically there is no ways, to lobby, to work with someone, because local authorities are afraid of the central authorities, and they're just trying to do everything to please them. So I think that we have very specific situation when society is actually quite progressive, and the authorities are very, very conservative, and they're trying to impose those conservative views on the whole society, and there is this battle. Thank you.
I would add on Ukrainian side, so in Ukraine, we had like some friendly politicians and MPs that would help us, but this is a very interesting phenomenon. They would get bullied in the parliament. Literally, their colleagues would blame them for all sorts of things just because they support LGBTQI people. And in this situation, it's very hard for us to really advocate and lobby the legislation that we need right now.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to add a dimension to that because it's an intriguing question. I would like to tie it into the previous question on the opposition, in that where we do see a lot of success often at the local level is not necessarily when it's political, as Leah and Svetlana have described, but when it comes to looking at building other kinds of coalitions. So where can LGBTI activists build alliances with doctors, with journalists, with teachers, with any kind of professionals who want to exercise their profession in ethical and morally high standards. And there often we see that a lot of change is possible when we don't only focus on the political and legal process. And I think that recognizing that kind of important local work is important. And I would like to tie it into the opposition work, because for me it's essentially also about alliance building. And Tamas just mentioned that a lot of the opposition is not just targeting the LGBTI movement, but also the sexual rights movement and the women's rights movement. And that is true. And I think what is important in ways of which we support activists who are working on sexual rights, on women's rights or LGBTI rights, is to consider how we bring groups together. Not just only on those fronts, but also with mainstream human rights organizations and those that stand up to defend democracy. This is often where LGBTI activists miss the time, the resources to build the connections. So recognizing when it comes to funding, the importance of alliance building is extremely important. And I think that ways in which you can all support that work is also looking out for opportunities in which embassies can be bringing people together, in which you as representatives can bring different kinds of allies together and help to work towards larger democratic agendas.
You're right. Coalition building is so important. And we often find you put together a group of organizations on the liberal end of the political spectrum. They don't just have to be human rights. You might find allies in the environmental community, for example. I don't know if you've seen that, but we certainly see that here, or the labor movement, or, it just depends. So that's great. Just briefly, Mr. Chairman, I wanted to ask about Turkey. In the last century, Turkey was seen as kind of a standard bearer for protecting LGBT rights and protecting them from the other countries in the neighborhood. But under Erdogan, under the last 10 years, they've gotten much more repressive. I wonder if you have any suggestions of what the U.S. can do in dealing with Turkey that might address this problem.
Yeah, unfortunately, Turkey is also looking at Putin's playbook in many ways increasingly in recent times. And I would almost answer the same things, because when you look at how the movement currently is under attack, it's in the field of freedom of expression, in freedom of assembly. All the things that have been mentioned during this hearing are affecting the community at the moment, in that online spaces are increasingly no longer safe. So I think what is extremely important is to raise these issues bilaterally, but very carefully and very respectfully, because Erdogan, in kind of defending his political territorium at the moment, is really using the narrative of Western values very much. So I think it's important that when the issue is brought up, that it's brought up as an issue that is about freedom of expression, that is about defending democracy, that is about defending pluralism. And we see in the run-up to the elections that will take place in Turkey in 2 years that Erdogan is losing popularity. So the question really is, what is going to happen around those elections, and what work can be done on the ground in building kind of a broader political agenda that is looking at different sets of value. So supporting broad civil society initiatives, of which the LGBTI movement is a part, I think is one of the critical factors of success at the moment.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative. I'd like to thank Mr. Van Roosendaal. I'd like to thank Dr. Emson and Ms. Zakharova, as well as Mr. Dombosch, for your excellent testimony here today. It's not just your testimony, but the courage that you've given speaking up. You're speaking up in many instances in territories where it's very difficult to speak up. It's very difficult to come forward. And I want to let you know this committee appreciates your efforts, but also your courage doing this. This is so important. I also would like to ask you if, since this came up as a subject matter in today's testimony, if you have any more specific suggested language you could have. We'd like to move forward with Representative Titus's suggestion that we contact the White House and make sure with the distribution of vaccines, as we export that assistance, that it's done in an inclusive way, so that groups like the LGBTQI+ community is not excluded from having these life-saving vaccines. I think that's very important as well. And I do hope that all of you as witnesses appreciate the members that participated here today. I think if you check back on important legislation and advocacy, you're going to find the people that participated here are among the leaders in Congress in pushing forward protections for these very basic human rights. So I want to thank the members for participating as well today. So with that, I just would say that a little bit of housekeeping. The members of the committee will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous materials, and questions for the record, subject to the limitation on rules. Again, I want to thank everyone for participating. This was indeed a very important, if not historic, congressional committee hearing today. And I think it will continue to break ground so that there's more attention at the global impact of this kind of discrimination. So with that, I'll call the hearing adjourned. Thank you all.